Hello, I'm Duncan. I'm the architecture editor at Golf Digest. Today we're looking at a single hole from one of the country's most original and influential courses, Pinehurst No. 2. And the hole we're going to examine is the par 5 fifth. Selecting a standout hole at Pinehurst No. 2 is a little like focusing on a single arabesque pattern in a large repeating tapestry. That analogy feels apt for No. 2, a course that's rhythmic and continuous, with one motif flowing into the next. The architecture presents a procession of gently sloping land, corridors of pine, sandy native areas, and the trademark turtleback greens, one after the other, though in different heights and shapes, all with uncompromising edges that spill into low chipping swales. Chipping and pitching is more than half the battle at Pinehurst, and shooting a high score at No. 2 is rarely the result of knockout punches, but rather death by 1,000 cuts. So why the fifth hole? Let's take a look. It measures 576 yards for the pros during tournaments, and somewhere in between 508 and 417 yards for everyone else, so it's not a particularly long hole. The drive plays over a slightly cresting fairway that obscures the landing area, down through a valley, and then back to a green that bubbles up in a hillside cove. The middle third of the hole tilts from high right to low left toward a no man's land of sand and wiregrass that stretches all the way from the tee to just short of the green. What makes the fifth hole so lethal is the green and its pernicious slope. The perimeter of the putting surface dips into shallow gutters of shortgrass behind and to the right, but the first third of the green is a false front, and the left edge curls away down an incline. You can see here the degree of right to left tilt internally and the severity of the edges. Shots that don't make it all the way onto the flatter part of the middle section of the green, that's the blue and green section which denotes a 1 to 2, perhaps 3% grade, will either roll back off the front of the green or to the left. Anything that's red, orange, or pink in this case is unpinnable and denotes that a ball is going to slide off the edges. That doesn't sound like a terrible thing given how typical it is for Pinehurst, but left and short left at No. 5 are two of the worst misses on the course. Everything on the left falls steeply away from the green. Once a ball starts rolling this direction, there's nothing to stop it. In dry conditions, and No. 2 is kept dry and fast, it might roll 60 or 70 feet, getting worse and worse by the second, all the way down to the fourth tee, 10 or 15 feet below the level of the green. Incoming shots to the front that don't make it at least 15 paces onto the putting surface will also reverse course and slowly tumble backwards into the bunkers or sand or the pine straw. It's routine to watch resort players take 2 or 3 shots to get back up to the green from down there. They may hit a shot here and watch it tumble back to down to their feet, hit another one and do the same thing before they finally get it all the way back onto the green. The fairway is nearly 50 yards wide over the crest and 35 yards in the long rollout area, so the drive isn't that taxing. The professionals and top amateurs can get around the green in 2 shots without much problem, but everyone else needs to favor the right side. You'll notice in these older photographs from the 1990s that the fairway is bordered in thick Bermuda rough. This is how No. 2 came to look in the 1970s when the resort sodded grass to replace the natural sand buffers that had always distinguished Pinehurst. The course looked overly gardened, and there was even a little tree back here behind the green that's since been removed. In 2010, Pinehurst hired Bill Coore and Ben Crenshaw to return the native sand and tufted grass look, and the Bermuda rough, which had given the course a monochromatic color, was stripped away. Coore and Crenshaw also rebuilt the bunkers, flashing the sand slightly up into the faces based on what the course looked like in photos from the 1930s and 40s. The restoration brought back a much-needed texture and contrast. It also returned a rub-of-the-green element to playing No. 2, as shots that drift into the native areas may yield a clean lie or a ball stymied by a patch of thick wiregrass. If you play the hole with discipline, the fifth is a straightforward par 5. But imagine if it was a long par 4 instead, and players were compelled to hit long irons and even woods into that green. That's what it was prior to the 2014 U.S. Open. Before then, the fifth was long regarded as one of the country's toughest but most admired par 4s, playing up to 483 yards. The green was no easier to hold than it is today, perhaps even harder given the old, firm, bouncy Bermuda grass putting surfaces, but the extreme penalty for missing it was the same. Pinehurst has made everyone who's played it wonder, at least once, who would build greens like this, especially one as severe as the fifth. The default answer is the architect, Donald Ross, but the more accurate answer is perhaps no one did. How's that so? The original 9 holes, which no longer exist, were built in 1901. They were laid out over the current 1st and 18th holes and the area in between them. In 1907, Donald Ross, Pinehurst's head professional and do-everything man for 48 years starting in 1900, removed those very short, rudimentary holes and expanded the course outward into a full 18, though it was only about 5,700 yards long. From 1908 through the end of the 1920s, Ross modified the holes at number 2 almost yearly, making them longer, adding and removing bunkers, deleting some holes and replacing them with others, and reconceptualizing the strategies as his views on architecture developed. In 1923, for instance, he added the current 3rd and 6th holes on new land to the northeast. As you can see here, this is number 3, the short dogleg right par 4, and the par 3 6th coming back the other way. By this time, Pinehurst had an unprecedented 72 holes of golf available and more courses planned. In 1928, Ross even built a new 9-hole course designated for non-resort play. It was simply called the Employees Course, on land that continued into the woods along Midland Avenue beyond the 3rd and 6th holes. In this diagram, you can see again, here's the 3rd hole of number 2 and the 6th hole, the par 3 playing back. But through all this tinkering and expansion, there wasn't much he could do with the greens. No one had yet figured out how to grow consistent turf in the nutrient-poor soils of North Carolina's sandhills, and Pinehurst's greens were essentially rectangles and small circles of hard clay, and therefore flat and lifeless. It wasn't until the early 1930s, after years of testing and experimentation, that Ross and greenkeeper Frank Maples found the right combination of soil amendments, seed, and fertilizers to grow grass, and they slowly began to convert areas of the Pinehurst courses to the new Bermuda. Around the same time, the last pieces of the modern number 2 course were put into place. Early economic pains of the Great Depression forced the resort to close the short-lived Employees Course. But instead of abandoning all of it, Ross realized that its 1st and 9th holes, running parallel to each other, traveled over some of the property's best terrain. He knew they were as good, if not better, than the other holes, so he adopted them as the number 2 course's 4th and now our 5th hole. In 1935, in preparation for the 1936 PGA Championship, Ross and Maples reconstructed and grassed for the first time each green of the number 2 course. Unfortunately, almost without exception, there are no records exactly of what these greens looked like, beyond a handful of old photographs. As you can see, they're quite different from what the greens have evolved into today. They're lower to the ground and possess nice wavy, twisty internal movements. These particular photographs were taken in 1935 and during the 1936 PGA Championship, so this is what they looked like immediately after Ross and Maples grassed and contoured them.
Let's visit the Pinehurst Country Club, home of the famous North-South Championship course. And from the veranda of the clubhouse, we view Maniac Hill, where golfers tune up their shots before they tee off. Almost every champion in America has pushed a ball around this practice green.
Ross normally left behind detailed hole-by-hole sketches, notes, and green elevations for the courses he designed around the country. They looked like this. This is an example from East Lake's number 2 course that was built in the 1920s. You can see how specific he was with notes and elevations. These functioned as blueprints so contractors and associates could carry out his ideas when he wasn't around. And as the architect of as many as 400 courses across the U.S., he often wasn't around. But he was at Pinehurst, where he lived in a cottage off the 3rd hole. Because he was on site each summer to oversee the constant renovations, he didn't need to draft blueprints, or at least if he did, they don't seem to exist anymore. Records show that during the late Depression, the lean years of World War II, and following the war, Pinehurst was aggressively top-dressing the greens with sand. Top dressing is a routine maintenance practice that helps firm and smooth out the greens that every course in the world does once or twice a year, if not more. Ross's greens sat much lower in profile than they do now. If we look at what would be a cross-section of one of his greens, it might come in level, have a little contour, an internal movement, a wave, and then perhaps it had one larger crest on one side. The grass would have come up close to the edge of the green, and even though it might have been kept at fairway height, the fairway heights in the 1930s and 40s and even 50s was much longer than it is today, so it would come up to the edge and kind of hold balls onto the putting surface, or they wouldn't drift off too far. If a ball landed here and went off, it might stop right there. The top dressing was applied, though, only to the putting surface, so as they started to layer sand on top of it to help firm and smooth out the greens, you'd get a slow accumulation to build up. Another year, a couple goes by, it starts to look like this. Next thing you know, after 10, 20, even 30 years, you have a green that has much more exaggerated contours than it does now. Now you have a green that looks like this, which was much more modestly contoured before. As turf and maintenance equipment evolved as well, and superintendents were able to cut the fairways at a shorter and shorter heights, this grass now, which used to be long and held up, was now shaved down. So that ball that used to stop here isn't going to stop here anymore. It's going to come all the way down. Once it gets over this edge, it's going all the way down this edge as well. So as you can see, over time, the putting surfaces rose, the surrounding areas remained the same, even though the grass became tighter, moving balls farther away from the putting surfaces on missed shots. Golfers often talk about prototypical Donald Ross greens. What they really mean are the blister shapes we find at Pinehurst No. 2. But he didn't design greens like this. There may be a knoll or plateau-style greens on many of his courses, but not 18 of them, and not to the degree of this curvature. If you look at the available designs and sketches of courses in his portfolio, you won't see this kind of recurring concept. Other old courses may have evolved in a similar way for the same reasons, due to sand buildup, but it was not Ross's intention to make greens like we see here. Pinehurst No. 2 is unique because the greens slowly evolved into these shapes from versions that were designed to sit much lower in profile. Then, over time, the greens became at first accepted, and later, after years of play and study, sacred. Bill Corr and Ben Crenshaw realized how unique and profound these greens are, and they left them as they were when they worked on the course in 2010. The fifth green in particular is an apex example of their sublime tenacity. The slope on the left and to the front influence how approach shots are played, as well as recoveries and tactics all the way back to the tee. During the 1999 U.S. Open, the fifth was the most difficult hole on the course in relation to par, and the fifth most difficult on tour that year, averaging 4.55 strokes. At the 2005 Open, it was the third most difficult. So why change it to a par 5? As with many things in contemporary golf, it has to do with the distances players are driving the ball. During the 1999 and 2005 Opens, the fourth measured 565 yards, about 10 yards less than the fifth does now, and it played shorter because of the downhill drive. But there was no way to make the fourth any longer to keep it relevant for tournament play. The tee had already been pushed back as far as it could be and created some pace of play issues by making players walk from the third green all the way back here, and if they tried to push the tee back any farther, it would be in somebody's backyard here. Making the fifth longer was also not an option until about 20 years ago. The building that housed the World Golf Hall of Fame, which opened in 1974, stood just behind the fifth tees, boxing them in. As you can see, it was a unique piece of architecture designed in a Washington, D.C.-like monumental style. The structure existed there until the early 2000s when it was torn down after the Hall of Fame moved to St. Augustine, Florida. Incidentally, the Hall of Fame moved back to Pinehurst in 2024, but in a different location. When the structure disappeared, there were suddenly nearly 100 extra yards of land to play with behind number 5, and new back tees were constructed in 2012. The fifth became a par 5, and the fourth was converted to a 529-yard par 4. Incidentally, playing as a par 5 in the 2014 U.S. Open, the fifth delivered roughly the same stroke average as the fourth had as a par 5 in 2005. And the fourth, as a par 4, was only marginally easier than the fifth was as a par 4. They essentially swapped places with little impact on scoring. The truth is, if Pinehurst or the USGA wanted to, they could probably name their score on these two holes by pushing the tees back as far as possible and putting the flags in sadistic hole locations, especially on the fifth green. If you can play these two holes in a combined 9 strokes, you've done well, no matter the combination of numbers. However, I'd argue in this case that par does make a difference, due to the psychological effect of making birdies and bogeys. Knowing on the fifth hole that you can get up and down around the green for a birdie is an entirely different mindset than knowing you must get up and down to make a par. And that change defangs one of the country's great, tough, 2-shot holes. That extra stroke, even if it's just ink on a card, removes the psychological edge the hole always possessed and transforms the fifth into a fairly basic 3-shot par 5. Golfers still fear the green, but they don't fear the hole like they once did. Still, at the end of the day, whether it's a 2-shot or 3-shot hole, a par 4 or a par 5, what hasn't changed at Pinehurst No. 2's fifth hole is the same old cardinal rule. Don't go left. Thanks for watching. If there's a famous hole you'd like to see us break down in the future, Let us know in the comments section below.